For over 5 millennia, humanity has searched for answers to the deepest questions of existence. We've looked to the stars, dug into ancient ruins, and examined sacred texts with microscopic precision. But what if the most profound truths were never lost at all? What if they were simply hidden? Deep beneath the marble floors of Vatican City, beyond the reach of tourists and pilgrims, lies a labyrinth of chambers that have remained sealed for centuries. These aren't just storage rooms or forgotten archives. These are vaults that contain knowledge so powerful, so potentially earth-shattering, that their very existence has been denied by those who swore to preserve truth above all else. You've felt it, haven't you? That nagging sensation that something crucial is missing from the story we've been told. That persistent whisper in the back of your mind, suggesting that the spiritual heritage of humanity is far richer, far more complex, and far more controversial than what reaches Sunday sermons or religious textbooks. Recent archaeological discoveries and scholarly research have begun to pull back the curtain on what many consider the most significant cover-up in human history. We're not talking about conspiracy theories or wild speculation. We're talking about documented evidence, authenticated manuscripts, and testimonies from researchers who have dedicated their lives to uncovering historical truth. The Vatican's Apostolic Secret Archives, recently renamed the Vatican Apostolic Archives in what some scholars call a strategic public relations move, contain an estimated 85 kilometers of shelving. That's over 52 miles of documents, scrolls, books, and artifacts spanning nearly 2,000 years of church history. But here's what they don't tell you. Significant portions of these archives remain classified, accessible only to a select few scholars who must undergo rigorous vetting and sign strict confidentiality agreements. What could be so dangerous that it requires such extreme secrecy? What discoveries could threaten the very foundations of organized religion as we know it? The answers, as we're about to discover, are more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. Consider this. Every year, thousands of archaeologists, historians, and biblical scholars make requests to access Vatican archives. Less than 150 are granted permission annually, and even those fortunate few are restricted to predetermined sections, with countless chambers remaining completely off-limits. The question isn't whether the Vatican is hiding something. The question is what exactly they're hiding and why. The story we're about to tell unfolds like a detective thriller, except the stakes aren't just academic curiosity or historical accuracy. The stakes are the spiritual identity of billions of people who have built their entire understanding of faith, morality, and divine purpose on what may be an incomplete or deliberately altered narrative. What happens when you discover that the woman closest to the central figure of Christianity wasn't the repentant sinner you were taught about, but potentially the most influential spiritual leader of the early church? What happens when you learn that entire Gospels, complete accounts of teachings and events, were deliberately excluded from the biblical canon not because they were false, but because they were inconvenient? What happens when you realize that the Christianity practiced by millions today might be fundamentally different from the spiritual movement that began in first-century Palestine? These aren't hypothetical questions anymore. Archaeological discoveries in Egypt, Jordan, and other Middle Eastern locations have unearthed manuscripts that paint a dramatically different picture of early Christianity. The Nag Hammadi Library, discovered in 1945, contained 52 texts that had been hidden for over 1,600 years. The Dead Sea Scrolls revealed practices and beliefs that challenge conventional religious narratives. And now, sources close to Vatican research suggest that even more significant discoveries have been made, but kept from public scrutiny. We stand at an unprecedented moment in human history. For the first time in centuries, technology and scholarly access are converging to shed light on truths that powerful institutions have worked tirelessly to keep in darkness. Carbon dating, linguistic analysis, and digital preservation techniques are making it impossible to suppress evidence that contradicts official narratives. But here's what makes this moment particularly crucial. We're living in an era where information wants to be free. The same technological revolution that allows us to communicate instantly across continents is making it increasingly difficult for any organization, no matter how powerful, to control the flow of knowledge. The chamber we're about to explore represents more than just a physical space filled with ancient documents. It represents a threshold between the world we thought we knew and the reality that scholarly evidence suggests actually exists. It's a gateway to understanding why certain voices were silenced, why specific teachings were suppressed, and why the full scope of humanity's spiritual heritage has been kept from us. As we embark on this investigation together, I want you to approach it with both an open mind and a critical eye. We're not here to attack anyone's faith or undermine sincere spiritual beliefs. We're here to examine evidence, ask difficult questions, and consider possibilities that mainstream institutions have been reluctant to acknowledge. The truth, as you're about to discover, is far more fascinating and far more empowering than the sanitized version we've been given. So take a deep breath, set aside any preconceptions you might have, and prepare to see 5,000 years of hidden history through new eyes. Because once you see what they found in that secret chamber, there's no going back to the comfortable simplicity of not knowing. To understand the magnitude of what recent discoveries have revealed, we need to first grasp the extraordinary scope and secretive nature of the Vatican's document preservation system. The Vatican Apostolic Archives aren't just a library, they're arguably the most comprehensive and closely guarded collection of historical documents in human civilization. The tradition of papal document preservation dates back to the 4th century, when Pope Damasus III began systematically collecting and cataloguing Christian writings. But the real expansion came during the medieval period, when the Catholic Church became not just a spiritual authority, but the primary educational and cultural institution of Europe. Every papal decree, every diplomatic correspondence, every theological debate, every controversial decision, all of it was meticulously recorded and stored. By the Renaissance, Vatican scribes and scholars had developed sophisticated preservation techniques that kept documents intact for centuries. They understood the power of written knowledge and the importance of controlling access to it. But they also understood something else. Some knowledge was too dangerous to destroy, yet too controversial to share. This led to what historians refer to as the selective preservation protocol, a system where documents were categorized not just by subject matter or chronological period, but by their potential to disrupt established religious and political order. The most sensitive materials were moved to specially constructed underground chambers, accessible only through hidden passages and protected by multiple layers of security. Academic researchers have long suspected that significant portions of early Christian history remain hidden in these restricted sections. Dr. Karen King's work at Harvard Divinity School has demonstrated how manuscript discoveries consistently reveal practices and beliefs that contradict traditional church teachings. Her analysis of the Gospel of Mary, for instance, suggests that women held far more prominent leadership roles in early Christianity than official church history acknowledges. Similarly, the work of scholars like Elaine Pagels at Princeton University has shown how the discovery of previously hidden texts fundamentally alters our understanding of Christian origins. The Gnostic Gospels, which remained buried for over 2,500 years, present versions of Jesus' teachings that emphasize personal spiritual experience over institutional authority, a message that directly challenges the hierarchical structure of organized religion. But here's what makes the Vatican's secret preservation system particularly intriguing. Unlike many ancient libraries that were destroyed by wars, natural disasters, or deliberate persecution, the Vatican archives have remained intact and continuously maintained for nearly 2 millennia. This means that documents which were considered too controversial for public consumption in the 4th century are still there, perfectly preserved, waiting to be examined. Recent developments in Vatican policy suggest that pressure from the international scholarly community is forcing some degree of transparency. Pope Francis's decision to open some previously classified World War II archives was seen by many historians as a test case, a way to gauge public reaction to controversial historical revelations. The response was telling. Rather than causing widespread disruption, the releases actually enhanced scholarly understanding and public appreciation for historical complexity. This success has emboldened researchers to push for access to much older and potentially more significant documents. Academic institutions across Europe and North America have formed consortiums specifically dedicated to advocating for expanded archive access. They argue that historical truth serves everyone's interests, regardless of how uncomfortable that truth might be. And here's where you become part of this story. What we're experiencing right now isn't just academic curiosity or historical detective work. We're witnessing the beginning of a fundamental shift in how religious and historical knowledge is shared with humanity. The discoveries we're about to explore together represent just the beginning of what promises to be the most significant revelation of suppressed historical truth in our lifetime. If you feel that pull, that sense that you're meant to be part of this moment when hidden knowledge finally comes to light, then you belong here with this community of truth seekers. Subscribe to join thousands of others who refuse to accept simplified versions of complex historical realities. Because what we're uncovering together is far too important to experience alone. The underground chambers we're about to explore weren't built to hide documents from enemies or protect them from natural disasters. Archaeological evidence suggests they were specifically designed to preserve knowledge while simultaneously controlling access to it. The architectural details tell a fascinating story. Multiple chambers connected by narrow passages, each requiring different keys, each containing documents sorted not just by topic, but by sensitivity level. Infrared scanning technology has revealed that some sections of these underground areas remain completely unexplored, even by Vatican scholars. Ground-penetrating radar suggests the existence of additional chambers that may predate the construction of St. Peter's Basilica itself. We are potentially looking at layers of hidden knowledge that stretch back not just centuries but millennia. The preservation techniques used in these secret chambers represent some of the most advanced pre-modern technology ever developed. Documents are stored in specially constructed containers designed to maintain consistent temperature and humidity levels. Some scrolls are wrapped in materials that modern scientists are still trying to identify and reproduce. The level of sophistication suggests that whoever designed these preservation systems understood that the knowledge contained within these documents would be crucial for future generations. But preservation was only half the equation. The other half was access control, ensuring that only specific individuals could examine these materials and only under carefully monitored conditions. This wasn't just about protecting documents from damage. This was about protecting institutions from the potential consequences of widespread knowledge about their contents. Now, for the first time in history, that carefully maintained control system is beginning to break down. The systematic preservation of controversial documents by religious institutions represents one of history's most complex preservation projects. For nearly 2,000 years, church scribes and scholars have maintained detailed records not just of official doctrine and approved teachings, but also of the alternative perspectives, disputed interpretations, and rejected manuscripts that shaped early Christianity. This preservation wasn't accidental. Church historians understood that future scholars would need access to complete historical records to understand how Christian doctrine developed over time. But they also understood that public access to certain documents could undermine institutional authority and create theological confusion among believers. The result was an elaborate system of categorization that divided Christian writings into multiple classifications. Canonical scriptures approved for public teaching, ecclesiastical documents for church leadership, scholarly materials for academic study, and restricted manuscripts deemed too controversial for general circulation. The restricted category is where things become particularly fascinating. These aren't just alternative versions of familiar biblical stories. These are complete theological frameworks that present fundamentally different understandings of divine nature, spiritual practice, and human purpose. Consider the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, portions of which were discovered in Egypt in the late 19th century. Academic analysis suggests this text presents Mary not as a reformed sinner, but as a spiritual teacher who received private instruction from Jesus that wasn't shared with the other disciples. The document describes teachings about the nature of sin, the process of spiritual ascension, and the relationship between material and spiritual reality that don't appear in canonical Gospels. More significantly, the text depicts the other disciples, including Peter, challenging Mary's authority and questioning whether Jesus would really have shared important teachings with a woman. This suggests that tensions over female spiritual leadership existed from the very beginning of the Christian movement, long before later church councils formally restricted women's roles. The Gospel of Thomas, another document that circulated widely in early Christian communities, contains 114 sayings attributed to Jesus that emphasize direct personal spiritual experience over institutional mediation. Saying 77, for instance, suggests that divine presence exists within all matter. Split a piece of wood and I am there. Lift up the stone and you will find me there. This pantheistic perspective differs dramatically from later theological developments that emphasized separation between sacred and secular realms. Perhaps most controversial is the Gospel of Philip, which describes spiritual practices and beliefs that later church authorities found incompatible with developing Orthodox doctrine. The text discusses concepts of spiritual marriage, divine feminine principles, and mystical union practices that were eventually suppressed as heretical. Recent scholarly analysis suggests these weren't fringe beliefs, but were actually central to many early Christian communities. The preservation of these documents in Vatican archives suggests that church authorities understood their historical significance even while rejecting their theological implications. Rather than destroying evidence of alternative early Christian perspectives, they maintained complete records while severely restricting access to them. This approach created what scholars call institutional historical memory, the preservation of complete historical records for future reference while maintaining public narrative control through selective disclosure. The practice allowed church leadership to maintain awareness of historical complexity while presenting simplified, unified doctrine to believers. But the preservation system also maintained something else, evidence of practices and beliefs that might become relevant again as human understanding evolved. Some scholars suggest that early church leaders anticipated that future generations might be better equipped to handle theological complexity that seemed too challenging for their contemporary audiences. The Gnostic tradition, for instance, emphasized personal spiritual experience and direct divine connection in ways that threatened established religious hierarchy. Rather than simply condemning these practices, church authorities documented them extensively while restricting their practice. The detailed records suggest ongoing fascination with mystical approaches to spirituality, even among those who officially rejected them. Similarly, documents discussing female spiritual leadership were preserved even as institutional policies increasingly restricted women's religious roles. The Gospel of Mary, the Acts of Thecla, and numerous other texts describing prominent female spiritual teachers remained in church archives despite centuries of male-dominated religious structure. These preservation decisions reveal something crucial about the difference between public religious policy and private scholarly understanding. While church doctrine became increasingly standardized and hierarchical, church scholars maintained detailed records of the diverse, complex, and often contradictory spiritual movements that comprised early Christianity. The implications are staggering. If these documents accurately represent early Christian belief and practice, then much of what modern believers consider essential Christian doctrine actually developed decades or centuries after the death of Jesus. Concepts like the Trinity, papal authority, clerical celibacy, and numerous other central tenets appear to be later theological developments rather than original Christian teachings. More importantly, the documents suggest that early Christian communities were far more diverse, inclusive, and spiritually experimental than later institutional Christianity became. Women served as teachers and leaders, mystical practices were common, and direct personal spiritual experience was valued over doctrinal conformity. The question that emerges from examining these preserved documents isn't whether alternative forms of Christianity existed. The evidence for that is overwhelming. The question is why these alternatives were systematically suppressed and whether their suppression was necessary for institutional stability or whether it represented a loss of valuable spiritual wisdom. As we examine what recent chamber discoveries have revealed, we begin to see patterns that suggest the suppression wasn't just about maintaining doctrinal unity. It was about maintaining institutional control over spiritual authority and religious interpretation. Archaeological discoveries over the past century have fundamentally transformed our understanding of early Christianity and forced scholars to reconsider many assumptions about religious development. Unlike theoretical or theological speculation, archaeological evidence provides concrete, datable artifacts that reveal what people actually believed and practiced, not just what religious authorities wanted them to believe. The most significant breakthrough came in 1945 near Nag Hammadi, Egypt, when a local farmer discovered 13 papyrus codices buried in a large jar. These manuscripts, dating from the 3rd and 4th centuries CE, contained complete texts that had been lost for over 1,500 years. The discovery revolutionized scholarly understanding of early Christian diversity and revealed the existence of sophisticated theological traditions that had been almost completely erased from historical memory. The Nag Hammadi library contained works like the Gospel of Truth, the Gospel of Thomas, and the Apocryphon of John, documents that present Jesus' teachings from perspectives that differ dramatically from canonical Gospels. Rather than emphasizing institutional authority or hierarchical religious structure, these texts focus on personal spiritual transformation and direct mystical experience. What makes these discoveries particularly significant is their archaeological context. These weren't random manuscripts that might have been altered or corrupted over time. They were carefully preserved documents that were deliberately buried by communities who wanted to protect them from destruction. Carbon dating and linguistic analysis confirm their authenticity and early date of composition. The Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered between 1947 and 1956 in caves near Qumran, provided another crucial piece of the historical puzzle. These documents revealed the existence of Jewish communities with messianic expectations and spiritual practices that closely parallel early Christian developments. The scrolls demonstrate that many concepts traditionally considered uniquely Christian, including communal living, ritual baptism, and expectation of a suffering Messiah, were already present in pre-Christian Jewish communities. More recently, discoveries in Jordan, Syria, and other Middle Eastern locations have continued to expand our understanding of early Christian diversity. The Gospel of Judas, discovered in the 1970s but not translated and published until 2006, presents the disciple traditionally considered Jesus' betrayer as actually his most faithful follower, carrying out a necessary sacrifice at Jesus' specific request. These archaeological discoveries share several common characteristics that distinguish them from later Christian documents. First, they consistently portray early Christian communities as more diverse, more inclusive of women's leadership, and more focused on personal spiritual experience than later institutional Christianity became. Second, they present theological concepts that were later condemned as heretical, but appear to have been mainstream in early Christian communities. The emphasis on direct divine connection, the importance of hidden spiritual knowledge, and the possibility of human spiritual transformation into divine consciousness appear repeatedly across multiple independent sources. Third, they consistently describe tensions between different interpretations of Jesus' message and different understandings of proper spiritual authority. Rather than presenting early Christianity as unified and harmonious, these documents reveal ongoing debates about fundamental questions of belief and practice. Archaeological evidence also reveals the systematic suppression of these alternative traditions. Excavations at early Christian sites consistently show evidence of document destruction, library burning, and the deliberate burial of manuscripts to protect them from persecution. The pattern suggests organized efforts to eliminate specific forms of Christian teaching and practice. Perhaps most significantly, archaeological discoveries have revealed that these alternative Christian traditions didn't simply disappear. They went underground. Communities in Egypt, Syria, Ethiopia, and other regions maintained Gnostic practices and preserved alternative gospels for centuries after they were officially condemned. The survival of these traditions suggests they answered spiritual needs that mainstream Christianity couldn't fully address. Recent discoveries continue to challenge conventional historical narratives. Ground-penetrating radar surveys of early Christian sites consistently reveal additional chambers, hidden libraries, and buried artifacts that haven't been fully explored. Each new discovery adds complexity to our understanding of early Christian history and raises new questions about what other evidence remains hidden. The cumulative impact of these archaeological discoveries is undeniable. Early Christianity was far more diverse, complex, and spiritually sophisticated than later institutional development suggests. The movement included multiple theological traditions, diverse leadership structures, and varied spiritual practices that were later standardized or eliminated. But here's what I want to know from you. As you learn about these archaeological discoveries, that reveal a more complex and diverse early Christianity. How does that change your understanding of spiritual truth? Does discovering that early Christian communities were more inclusive and mystically oriented challenge your faith, or does it open up new possibilities for spiritual growth? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I read every response, and your perspectives help shape how we explore these historical discoveries together. Whether you're approaching this from a place of faith, scholarly curiosity, or spiritual seeking, your voice matters in this conversation. These archaeological discoveries provide the foundation for understanding why certain documents were preserved in secret Vatican chambers. The physical evidence proves that alternative Christian traditions existed, thrived, and were systematically suppressed. Now we need to examine what happened to the documents these communities produced and why they were considered too dangerous for public access. The term forbidden texts carries dramatic connotations, but the reality of suppressed early Christian writings is far more nuanced and academically fascinating than conspiracy theories suggest. These documents weren't prohibited because they contained dangerous secrets or mystical powers. They were restricted because they presented theological perspectives and historical accounts that complicated the development of unified Christian doctrine. To understand why certain texts were considered problematic, we need to examine their actual content and compare it with canonical Gospels. The differences reveal fundamental disagreements about the nature of spiritual authority, the role of women in religious leadership, and the proper balance between personal spiritual experience and institutional guidance. The Gospel of Mary Magdalene, for instance, begins with a scene familiar from canonical Gospels, the disciples gathering after Jesus' death, uncertain about how to continue his mission. But then the narrative diverges dramatically. Mary shares teachings that Jesus gave her privately, including instructions about the nature of sin and the process of spiritual ascension that don't appear in any canonical text. According to this Gospel, Mary describes sin not as moral transgression, but as spiritual ignorance, a failure to recognize one's divine nature. She explains that spiritual growth involves releasing attachment to material concerns and developing direct awareness of divine presence within consciousness. These teachings emphasize personal spiritual development over institutional religious practice. The text also describes the other disciples' reaction to Mary's teachings. Peter explicitly challenges her authority, asking whether Jesus would really have shared important spiritual instruction with a woman. Levi defends Mary, suggesting that Jesus chose her as a teacher because she was more spiritually advanced than the male disciples. This exchange reveals early tensions about female spiritual leadership that later became institutionalized as restrictions on women's religious roles. The Gospel of Thomas presents another perspective that differs significantly from canonical accounts. Rather than focusing on Jesus' death and resurrection, this text emphasizes his role as a spiritual teacher who helps others discover their own divine nature. Saying 3 suggests that the kingdom of heaven exists as present spiritual reality rather than future reward. The kingdom is inside you and outside you. When you know yourselves, then you will be known. This emphasis on present spiritual transformation rather than future salvation represents a fundamental theological difference from later Christian development. Instead of requiring institutional mediation for salvation, the Gospel of Thomas suggests that direct spiritual realization is possible for anyone willing to engage in serious spiritual practice. The Gospel of Philip contains some of the most controversial material found in early Christian texts. This document discusses concepts of spiritual marriage, divine feminine principles, and mystical union practices that were completely eliminated from later Christian tradition. The text suggests that Jesus and Mary Magdalene had a special spiritual relationship that served as a model for other practitioners. More controversially, the Gospel of Philip discusses ritual practices designed to facilitate direct spiritual experience. These included forms of meditation, visualization, and what appears to be mystical union practices that enabled practitioners to experience divine consciousness directly. Such practices were later condemned as heretical because they suggested that individuals could access divine truth without institutional mediation. The Apocryphon of John presents perhaps the most sophisticated theological framework found in suppressed early Christian literature. This text describes the nature of divine reality using complex metaphysical concepts that influenced later mystical traditions. It discusses multiple levels of consciousness, the relationship between material and spiritual reality, and the process by which divine consciousness becomes individualized in human experience. What makes these texts particularly significant is their consistency across multiple independent sources. Despite being composed by different authors in different locations at different times, they share common themes that suggest widespread early Christian traditions focused on personal spiritual transformation and direct mystical experience. The suppression of these texts wasn't arbitrary or accidental. Church councils specifically identified and condemned the theological perspectives they contained. The Council of Nicaea in 325 CE and subsequent ecclesiastical gatherings systematically excluded writings that emphasized personal spiritual authority over institutional religious control. The practical implications of these suppressions were enormous. By restricting access to texts that described women's spiritual leadership, church authorities could more easily implement male-dominated religious hierarchy. By eliminating documents that emphasized personal spiritual experience, they could establish institutional mediation as necessary for salvation. By condemning mystical practices that enabled direct divine connection, they could maintain exclusive control over spiritual authority. But the suppression wasn't complete. Academic research has revealed that these alternative Christian traditions continued in various forms throughout Christian history. Mystical movements within Christianity consistently rediscovered practices and beliefs similar to those described in the forbidden texts. Female mystics like Hildegard of Bingen, Meister Eckhart's teachings about divine union, and contemplative traditions within monasticism all preserved elements of the spirituality described in suppressed early Christian writings. The preservation of these texts in restricted Vatican archives suggests that church authorities understood their historical and theological significance even while rejecting their practical implications. Rather than destroying evidence of alternative early Christian traditions, they maintained complete documentation while controlling access to it. Recent scholarly analysis of these texts has revealed sophisticated theological frameworks that address spiritual questions in ways that complement rather than contradict essential Christian insights about divine love, human purpose, and spiritual transformation. The differences from canonical Christianity appear to be more about emphasis and practice than fundamental spiritual principles. This raises fascinating questions about spiritual authority and religious development. If these texts accurately represent early Christian belief and practice, then much of what modern believers consider heretical may actually represent authentic Christian spiritual tradition. The suppression may have eliminated valuable spiritual wisdom rather than protecting believers from dangerous error. Perhaps no figure in early Christianity has been more misrepresented or more systematically marginalized than Mary Magdalene. The transformation of her historical reputation from prominent spiritual leader to repentant prostitute represents one of the most successful character assassinations in religious history and one of the most revealing examples of how institutional needs shaped biblical interpretation. Recent scholarly research, supported by archaeological discoveries and careful analysis of early Christian texts, presents a dramatically different picture of Mary Magdalene's actual role in the early Christian movement. Rather than being a peripheral figure who was rescued and reformed by Jesus, evidence suggests she was one of the most important leaders in early Christianity and possibly the person closest to understanding Jesus' spiritual teachings. The canonical Gospels, even in their edited form, contain numerous clues about Mary's actual significance. She appears at crucial moments in all four Gospels and is consistently portrayed as understanding aspects of Jesus' mission that other disciples miss. In the Gospel of John, she is the first person to whom the resurrected Jesus appears, and he gives her specific instructions to share with the other disciples, making her quite literally the first Christian apostle. But the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, preserved in fragmentary form and discovered in Egypt, provides far more detailed information about her role and teachings. This text presents Mary as a recipient of private spiritual instruction from Jesus and depicts her sharing advanced spiritual teachings with the other disciples after Jesus' death. The teachings focus on the nature of spiritual reality, the process of consciousness development, and methods for achieving direct divine connection. What makes Mary's teachings particularly significant is their sophisticated understanding of consciousness and spiritual development. She describes the soul's journey through different levels of awareness, explains how to overcome psychological obstacles to spiritual growth, and provides practical guidance for maintaining spiritual clarity in challenging circumstances. These teachings demonstrate a level of spiritual wisdom that suggests extensive training and direct experience with advanced contemplative practices. The Gospel of Philip goes even further, describing Mary as Jesus' closest spiritual companion and suggesting that their relationship served as a model for the kind of spiritual partnership that enables both individuals to achieve higher levels of consciousness. The text indicates that Jesus loved her more than all the disciples and regularly kissed her in ways that upset the other disciples. While later interpreters have debated whether these references are literal or metaphorical, the spiritual significance is clear. Mary had access to aspects of Jesus' teaching that weren't shared with others. Archaeological evidence supports the picture of Mary as a prominent early Christian leader. Inscriptions and artwork from early Christian communities consistently portray her as an apostolic figure. Some early Christian churches were dedicated to her, and she appears in prominent positions in religious artwork that predates later negative characterizations. The transformation of Mary's reputation appears to have been a deliberate process that served specific institutional purposes. By characterizing her as a reformed sinner rather than a spiritual teacher, church authorities could minimize the precedent her leadership might set for other women seeking religious authority. The prostitute narrative, which has no biblical support, effectively eliminated her as a model for female spiritual leadership. Pope Gregory I's identification of Mary Magdalene with the unnamed sinful woman in Luke's Gospel represents a crucial turning point in this character transformation. This conflation, which occurred in 591 CE, had no historical or textual justification, but served to redirect attention from Mary's role as a spiritual teacher to her supposed need for moral reformation. The systematic marginalization of Mary Magdalene coincided with broader restrictions on women's roles in church leadership. As institutional Christianity became more hierarchical and politically powerful, female spiritual authority became increasingly problematic for male religious leaders. By eliminating Mary as a model of female apostolic authority, church officials could more easily justify excluding women from leadership positions. But suppressed early Christian texts suggest that Mary's teachings weren't lost. They went underground. Gnostic communities continued to honor her as a spiritual teacher, and mystical traditions within Christianity preserved practices and perspectives similar to those attributed to her in forbidden Gospels. Female mystics throughout Christian history consistently rediscovered spiritual insights similar to those described in the Gospel of Mary. Modern scholarship has begun to restore understanding of Mary's historical significance. Research by scholars like Karen King at Harvard, Elaine Pagels at Princeton, and Jane Scharberg at the University of Detroit has demonstrated that early Christian sources consistently portray Mary as a prominent leader whose teachings were valued by early Christian communities. The implications of this scholarly research extend far beyond historical curiosity. If Mary Magdalene was indeed a prominent spiritual teacher whose insights were systematically suppressed, then Christianity has been operating for centuries with incomplete understanding of its own foundational teachings. The spiritual wisdom attributed to her in early Christian texts addresses questions about consciousness, spiritual development, and divine connection that remain relevant for contemporary spiritual seekers. Furthermore, the suppression of Mary's teachings represents the loss of female spiritual wisdom that might have provided valuable balance to the increasingly masculine institutional Christianity that developed over subsequent centuries. Her emphasis on direct spiritual experience, consciousness development, and the integration of feminine spiritual principles might have prevented some of the rigidity and authoritarianism that later characterized institutional religious practice. The recent scholarly rehabilitation of Mary Magdalene isn't just about correcting historical misunderstanding. It's about recovering lost spiritual wisdom that might be crucial for contemporary spiritual development. The Council of Nicaea in 325 CE represents one of the most significant moments in Christian history, the point at which diverse early Christian communities were forced to choose between theological plurality and institutional unity. The decisions made at this council and subsequent ecclesiastical gatherings established the framework for Orthodox Christian doctrine while systematically excluding alternative perspectives that had been widespread in early Christian communities. To understand the significance of these decisions, we need to recognize the extraordinary diversity that characterized early Christianity before institutional standardization. Archaeological evidence and surviving manuscripts reveal dozens of different Christian communities with varying beliefs about Jesus' nature, different spiritual practices, and alternative interpretations of his teachings. Some emphasized his divine nature, others his humanity. Some focused on his death and resurrection, others on his role as a spiritual teacher. Some developed hierarchical leadership structures, others remained egalitarian. This diversity wasn't considered problematic during Christianity's first 3 centuries. Different communities simply emphasized different aspects of Jesus' message and developed practices suited to their cultural contexts and spiritual needs. The letters of Paul reveal ongoing theological debates, but these were seen as normal aspects of a developing spiritual movement rather than dangerous threats to religious unity. The situation changed dramatically when Emperor Constantine legalized Christianity and began using religious unity as a tool for political consolidation. The Arian controversy, a theological dispute about the relationship between God the Father and Jesus Christ, threatened to divide the newly legalized church and undermine Constantine's political objectives. Rather than allowing theological diversity to continue, Constantine convened the Council of Nicaea to establish unified doctrine. The council's proceedings reveal the political pressures that influenced theological decision-making. Bishops arrived with dramatically different perspectives on fundamental questions about Christ's nature, salvation, and proper religious practice. Rather than seeking synthesis or accommodation, the council forced binary choices: orthodox versus heretical, acceptable versus condemned, included versus excluded. The Nicene Creed, produced by this council, established specific language about Christ's relationship to God that effectively excluded numerous theological perspectives that had been legitimate parts of early Christian tradition. Communities that had emphasized Jesus' humanity over his divinity, or that had understood salvation as spiritual transformation rather than institutional mediation, found their beliefs officially condemned. But the Council of Nicaea addressed only one aspect of religious standardization: the formation of the biblical canon, the selection of which writings would be considered authoritative scripture, occurred through a series of decisions made over several centuries. These decisions involved complex negotiations between different Christian communities, each with their own collections of valued texts. The criteria used for canonical selection reveal the institutional priorities that shaped Orthodox Christianity. Texts were evaluated not just for their spiritual value or historical authenticity, but for their compatibility with developing church structure and doctrine. Writings that emphasized institutional authority were favored over those that promoted individual spiritual experience. Texts that supported male religious leadership were preferred over those that described female spiritual teachers. The Gospel of Thomas, for instance, was excluded despite being as early as the canonical Gospels and containing teachings attributed directly to Jesus. Its emphasis on personal spiritual realization rather than institutional mediation made it incompatible with the hierarchical church structure that was developing. Similarly, the Gospel of Mary was excluded because its portrayal of female spiritual leadership conflicted with emerging restrictions on women's religious roles. The process of canon formation also involved active suppression of excluded texts. Church authorities didn't simply ignore writings they considered inappropriate. They ordered them destroyed and prohibited their circulation. The survival of texts like the Nag Hammadi library demonstrates that some communities defied these orders and preserved forbidden writings, but the vast majority of alternative early Christian literature was lost. Archaeological evidence suggests that the suppression was systematic and widespread. Excavations at early Christian sites reveal evidence of library destruction, document burning, and the deliberate burial of manuscripts to protect them from persecution. The pattern indicates organized efforts to eliminate specific theological perspectives from Christian tradition. The long-term consequences of these canonical decisions were enormous. By restricting the range of acceptable Christian belief and practice, church authorities created institutional unity, but eliminated spiritual diversity that had characterized early Christianity. Mystical traditions, female spiritual leadership, and emphasis on personal spiritual experience were marginalized or driven underground. Recent scholarly analysis suggests that many of the excluded texts contained valuable spiritual wisdom that might have enriched Christian tradition if it had been preserved. The emphasis on direct spiritual experience found in Gnostic texts, the sophisticated understanding of consciousness described in mystical writings, and the inclusive leadership models portrayed in texts featuring female teachers all represented spiritual resources that were lost to mainstream Christianity. The Council of Nicaea and subsequent canonical decisions weren't inherently wrong, but they represented specific choices about institutional priorities that had profound consequences for Christian spiritual development. Understanding these decisions helps explain why certain perspectives were preserved in secret archives, while others became the foundation for Orthodox doctrine. The convergence of archaeological discoveries, advanced scholarly analysis, and technological innovation has created an unprecedented opportunity to examine early Christian history with scientific rigor. Modern research methods, including carbon dating, linguistic analysis, digital imaging, and comparative textual studies, are revealing aspects of Christian origins that were previously hidden or misunderstood. Perhaps the most significant development is the application of critical historical methodology to religious texts and traditions. Scholars can now trace the development of specific doctrines through multiple sources, identify later editorial additions to early texts, and distinguish between authentic historical accounts and theological interpretations added by subsequent generations. Digital imaging technology has revolutionized the study of ancient manuscripts. Techniques like multispectral imaging can reveal text that has been erased or written over, allowing researchers to recover lost portions of important documents. The Archimedes palimpsest project, for instance, used these methods to reveal mathematical texts that had been scraped away and written over with religious material. Similar techniques applied to early Christian manuscripts are revealing layers of editing and revision that show how theological perspectives evolved over time. DNA analysis and archaeological dating methods have provided new insights into the historical context of early Christianity. Recent excavations in Palestine and surrounding regions have revealed details about daily life, religious practices, and social structures in first-century Jewish communities that help scholars understand the environment in which Christianity developed. These discoveries consistently show that early Christian communities were more diverse and experimental than later institutional development suggests. Linguistic analysis has become particularly important for understanding the original meaning of key theological concepts. Many terms that seem clear in modern translations carried very different meanings in their original languages and cultural contexts. The Greek word ekklesia, typically translated as church, originally meant any kind of assembly or gathering, not specifically a religious institution. Understanding these linguistic shifts helps explain how institutional Christianity developed from what began as informal spiritual communities. Comparative religious studies have revealed striking parallels between early Christian practices and contemporary mystery religions, philosophical schools, and Jewish mystical traditions. Rather than developing in isolation, early Christianity appears to have borrowed freely from surrounding spiritual traditions while developing its own distinctive synthesis. This cultural integration explains many features of early Christian practice that seem unusual when viewed only through the lens of later Orthodox doctrine. Modern psychological and consciousness research has also provided new perspectives on mystical experiences described in early Christian texts. Studies of meditation, contemplative practice, and altered states of consciousness help contemporary researchers understand what early Christian mystics were actually experiencing and why their practices were considered spiritually significant. This research suggests that many suppressed early Christian practices were sophisticated methods for facilitating genuine spiritual development. The cumulative impact of these modern research methods is profound. They consistently reveal that early Christianity was more complex, diverse, and spiritually sophisticated than institutional Christianity became. The suppression of alternative perspectives, appears to have eliminated valuable spiritual wisdom rather than protecting believers from dangerous error. Perhaps most importantly, modern research has revealed patterns of institutional control over religious knowledge that continue to influence contemporary spiritual life. The same mechanisms that were used to suppress alternative early Christian perspectives, restricting access to source materials, controlling scholarly interpretation, and discouraging independent investigation, continue to shape how religious history is presented to believers today. This creates both challenges and opportunities for contemporary spiritual seekers. On one hand, discovering that traditional religious narratives are incomplete or inaccurate can be deeply unsettling for people whose spiritual identity is built on those narratives. On the other hand, recovering suppressed spiritual wisdom can provide resources for spiritual development that aren't available through conventional religious channels. The digital revolution has made it increasingly difficult for any institution to maintain exclusive control over historical information. Ancient texts are being digitized and made available online, scholarly research is being published in accessible formats, and international collaboration is enabling comprehensive examination of previously restricted materials. This democratization of knowledge access is accelerating the pace of historical discovery and making it impossible to suppress inconvenient evidence. But here's what I'm curious about. As you learn about these modern discoveries that reveal a more complex and diverse early Christianity, where are you watching this from? I want to see how far this awakening to historical truth is spreading around the world. Comment below with your city or country. Let's create a map of this global community that's ready to examine evidence rather than simply accepting traditional narratives. Whether you're watching from New York or Nigeria, São Paulo or Stockholm, your voice is part of this worldwide conversation about spiritual truth and historical honesty. The implications of modern research extend far beyond academic curiosity. If early Christian communities were more inclusive, more mystically oriented, and more focused on personal spiritual development than later institutional Christianity became, then recovering these suppressed traditions might provide resources for addressing contemporary spiritual needs that conventional religion hasn't fully met. The emphasis on direct spiritual experience found in suppressed early Christian texts speaks to contemporary interest in meditation, mindfulness, and contemplative practice. The inclusive leadership models described in texts featuring female teachers address ongoing debates about gender equality in religious institutions. The sophisticated understanding of consciousness described in Gnostic writings parallels modern psychological and neuroscientific research about the nature of human awareness. Modern revelations about early Christian diversity don't threaten authentic spiritual development. They enhance it by providing access to the full range of spiritual wisdom that was available to early Christian communities. Rather than weakening faith, historical honesty can strengthen it by grounding spiritual practice in complete understanding rather than partial information. The question facing contemporary believers isn't whether to accept modern historical discoveries, but how to integrate new knowledge with authentic spiritual commitment. The evidence is now too overwhelming to ignore, but the spiritual significance of that evidence remains open to interpretation and personal exploration. One of the most significant losses in the development of institutional Christianity was the systematic marginalization of feminine spiritual wisdom and female religious leadership. Archaeological evidence and suppressed early Christian texts reveal that women played central roles in early Christian communities as teachers, prophets, leaders, and preservers of advanced spiritual practices that were later eliminated from mainstream Christian tradition. The canonical New Testament, despite centuries of editing that minimized women's roles, still contains numerous references to prominent female leaders in early Christian communities. Phoebe is described as a deacon, Prisca as a teacher who instructed even the eloquent Apollos, and Junia as an apostle who was prominent among the apostles. These references represent just the tip of the iceberg, evidence that survived despite systematic efforts to minimize women's contributions to early Christianity. The Gospel of Mary Magdalene provides far more detailed information about women's spiritual roles in early Christian communities. This text presents Mary not just as a follower of Jesus, but as a recipient of advanced spiritual teachings that weren't shared with the male disciples. Her instructions about the nature of consciousness, the process of spiritual ascension, and methods for overcoming psychological obstacles to spiritual growth demonstrate sophisticated understanding of contemplative practice and mystical development. The Gospel of Philip describes spiritual partnership between men and women as essential for achieving higher levels of consciousness. Rather than viewing gender differences as hierarchical, this text suggests that masculine and feminine spiritual qualities complement each other in ways that enable both partners to achieve spiritual realization that wouldn't be possible alone. This perspective on sacred relationship differs dramatically from later Christian teachings that emphasized celibacy or male spiritual authority. Early Christian art and architecture provide additional evidence of women's prominent roles in early communities. Frescoes in Roman catacombs show women leading worship services, administering sacraments, and teaching from Scripture. Some early churches contain inscriptions honoring female presbyters, bishops, and spiritual teachers. This artistic evidence suggests that women's religious leadership was common enough to be publicly celebrated rather than hidden or exceptional. The systematic suppression of feminine spiritual wisdom appears to have been a gradual process that accelerated as Christianity became more institutionally powerful. Early Christian communities that emphasized personal spiritual experience and egalitarian leadership naturally included prominent female teachers. As institutional Christianity developed hierarchical structures and sought political legitimacy within patriarchal Roman society, female religious authority became increasingly problematic. The pastoral epistles in the New Testament, which scholars generally agree were written considerably later than other Pauline letters, contain explicit restrictions on women's teaching roles that contradict earlier evidence of female leadership. These texts appear to represent later institutional attempts to standardize religious practice rather than original apostolic teaching. The contrast between early evidence of female leadership and later restrictions suggests deliberate policy changes rather than consistent Christian tradition. The elimination of feminine spiritual wisdom had profound consequences for Christian mystical development. Many suppressed early Christian texts describe spiritual practices and perspectives that emphasized qualities traditionally associated with feminine consciousness: intuitive wisdom, emotional depth, relational awareness, and holistic understanding. The marginalization of these approaches impoverished Christian spirituality by eliminating essential resources for balanced spiritual development. Gnostic communities preserved traditions of feminine spiritual wisdom long after they were suppressed in mainstream Christianity. The figure of Sophia, divine wisdom, remained central to Gnostic theology as a feminine principle of divine consciousness that enables spiritual understanding and transformation. Gnostic texts describe Sophia's role in creation, redemption, and the awakening of human consciousness to divine reality. The concept of the divine feminine wasn't unique to Christianity, but represented a widespread understanding in ancient Mediterranean cultures that divine reality included both masculine and feminine principles. The systematic elimination of feminine divine imagery from Christianity represented a significant departure from prevailing religious understanding rather than a natural development of monotheistic faith. Female mystics throughout Christian history consistently rediscovered spiritual insights and practices similar to those described in suppressed early Christian texts. Figures like Hildegard of Bingen, Julian of Norwich, Teresa of Avila, and numerous other female contemplatives developed sophisticated understanding of consciousness, divine union, and spiritual transformation that paralleled teachings found in forbidden gospels. Their experiences suggest that feminine spiritual wisdom continued to emerge despite institutional suppression. Contemporary scholarship has begun to recover understanding of feminine spiritual wisdom within Christian tradition. Researchers like Rosemary Radford Ruther, Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza, and Karen Torjussen have demonstrated that female spiritual leadership was normative in early Christianity, and that its suppression represented historical accident rather than divine mandate. The implications of recovering feminine spiritual wisdom extend far beyond gender equality issues. The contemplative practices, relational awareness, and holistic spiritual perspectives preserved in texts featuring female teachers address spiritual needs that purely masculine religious approaches often fail to meet. Integrating feminine spiritual wisdom with traditional Christian teaching provides resources for more complete and effective spiritual development. Modern interest in contemplative practice, creation spirituality, and relational approaches to divine connection reflects ongoing hunger for the kind of spiritual wisdom that was preserved in traditions honoring feminine religious authority. Rather than representing departure from authentic Christianity, recovering feminine spiritual wisdom may be essential for restoring the complete spiritual heritage that early Christian communities possessed. The systematic marginalization of women's spiritual contributions represents one of Christianity's greatest losses, not just for women, but for all believers who have been denied access to essential spiritual wisdom that might have enriched their faith and accelerated their spiritual development. Early Christian communities developed sophisticated symbolic languages that allowed them to preserve and transmit spiritual teachings while avoiding persecution from Roman authorities, and later, suppression by Orthodox Church officials. These symbolic systems weren't mere decorative elements or simple identification markers. They were complex coding methods that preserved advanced spiritual concepts and mystical practices in forms that could survive institutional opposition. The most familiar early Christian symbol, the fish, ichthys, functioned on multiple levels of meaning that extended far beyond simple identification of Christian believers. The Greek word for fish served as an acronym for Jesus Christ, Son of God, Savior, but the symbol also connected to ancient wisdom traditions that understood fish as symbols of consciousness swimming in the ocean of divine awareness. Early Christian texts suggest that the fish symbol encoded teachings about the relationship between individual consciousness and universal divine presence. The cross, which became Christianity's primary symbol, originally carried meanings that were largely lost when it became an institutional religious marker. Early Christian texts describe the cross not just as representing Jesus' death, but as a cosmic symbol representing the intersection of divine and human consciousness, the meeting point of heaven and earth, and the axis around which spiritual transformation occurs. The Gospel of Philip specifically discusses the cross as a symbol of mystical union and spiritual resurrection. More complex symbolic systems appear in early Christian art and architecture that decorated underground meeting places and hidden worship sites. These symbols functioned as spiritual textbooks that preserved advanced teachings about consciousness development, divine nature, and mystical practice in visual forms that could be studied and contemplated without attracting unwanted attention from authorities. The rose became particularly significant in early Christian symbolism as a representation of divine love, spiritual unfolding, and the hidden heart of mystical teaching. The rose appears repeatedly in suppressed early Christian texts as a symbol of the soul's relationship to divine reality. Later Christian tradition preserved some understanding of rose symbolism, but the sophisticated spiritual practices associated with it were largely eliminated from mainstream Christianity. Geometric patterns found in early Christian art contain encoded information about spiritual principles and contemplative practices. Sacred geometry wasn't just decorative, but represented visual methods for understanding the mathematical and harmonic principles underlying spiritual reality. Early Christian communities used geometric meditation practices that were later condemned as heretical, but preserved in symbolic form in artwork and architectural details. Number symbolism played a crucial role in early Christian spiritual teaching. The significance of specific numbers, 3, 7, 12, 40, wasn't arbitrary, but encoded teachings about consciousness development, cosmic cycles, and spiritual transformation processes. The systematic use of number symbolism in early Christian texts suggests sophisticated understanding of mathematical principles underlying spiritual development. The development of Christian iconography involved complex negotiations between preserving spiritual meaning and avoiding persecution. Early Christian artists developed techniques for hiding advanced spiritual teachings within apparently conventional religious imagery. Multiple layers of symbolic meaning allowed the same artwork to function as simple religious decoration for casual observers, while preserving complex spiritual instruction for initiated practitioners. Architectural symbolism in early Christian meeting places encoded information about spiritual practices and community organization. The orientation of buildings, the placement of decorative elements, and the design of interior spaces All carried symbolic meanings that guided spiritual practice and preserved information about proper contemplative techniques. These architectural codes allowed communities to maintain their spiritual traditions even when verbal teaching became dangerous. The suppression of symbolic literacy represents one of the most significant losses in Christian spiritual development. As institutional Christianity became more concerned with doctrinal conformity and less interested in mystical practice, the ability to read and interpret spiritual symbols was gradually lost. Complex symbolic systems that had preserved advanced spiritual teachings for centuries became mere decorations with no recognized spiritual significance. However, symbolic traditions weren't completely eliminated but went underground, surfacing in various mystical movements throughout Christian history. Medieval Christian mystics consistently rediscovered symbolic languages similar to those used in early Christian communities. Gothic cathedral architecture preserved geometric and symbolic principles derived from earlier Christian mystical traditions, even when their spiritual significance was no longer widely understood. Contemporary scholars studying early Christian symbolism have discovered that many symbols contained multiple layers of meaning that addressed different levels of spiritual development. Beginning practitioners could understand basic symbolic meanings, while advanced students could access more sophisticated spiritual concepts encoded in the same symbols. This multi-level approach allowed communities to preserve complex spiritual teachings in forms accessible to practitioners at various stages of development. The recovery of early Christian symbolic literacy provides contemporary spiritual seekers with access to contemplative practices and spiritual concepts that aren't available through conventional religious channels. Understanding the symbolic languages used by early Christian communities opens doorways to spiritual wisdom that was preserved in hidden form for centuries. Modern interest in sacred geometry, symbolic meditation, and visual contemplative practices reflects ongoing hunger for the kind of symbolic spiritual teaching that early Christian communities possessed. Rather than representing departure from Christian tradition, recovering symbolic literacy may be essential for accessing the complete spiritual heritage that institutional Christianity has largely forgotten. The systematic elimination of symbolic spiritual teaching represents a significant impoverishment of Christian contemplative tradition, one that contemporary believers are beginning to recognize and attempt to remedy through renewed study of early Christian symbolic systems. The accumulation of archaeological evidence, scholarly research, and recovered manuscripts presents contemporary Christianity with both unprecedented challenges and extraordinary opportunities. For the first time in history, believers have access to comprehensive information about the diversity, complexity, and spiritual sophistication of early Christian communities. How contemporary Christians respond to this information will likely determine the future direction of Christian spiritual development. The most immediate challenge involves reconciling traditional religious narratives with historical evidence that reveals those narratives to be incomplete or, in some cases, deliberately altered. Many believers have built their spiritual identity on understandings of Christian history and practice that archaeological discoveries have shown to be oversimplified or inaccurate. Discovering that early Christianity was more diverse, more inclusive, and more mystically oriented than later institutional development suggests can be deeply unsettling for people whose faith depends on certainty about traditional teachings. However, this challenge also represents an opportunity for spiritual growth and deepening. Access to the full range of early Christian spiritual wisdom provides resources for addressing contemporary spiritual needs that conventional Christianity hasn't always met effectively. The emphasis on personal spiritual experience found in suppressed early Christian texts speaks directly to modern interest in contemplative practice, mindfulness, and direct mystical experience. The recovery of feminine spiritual wisdom offers particular opportunities for contemporary Christian communities struggling with questions about gender equality and women's religious roles. Rather than representing modern innovation, inclusive leadership models and recognition of feminine spiritual authority can be understood as recovery of authentic early Christian practice that was suppressed for institutional rather than theological reasons. Similarly, the sophisticated understanding of consciousness and spiritual development found in early Christian mystical texts provides resources for integrating contemporary psychological insights with traditional Christian teaching. The emphasis on spiritual transformation, consciousness development, and direct divine connection found in suppressed texts aligns closely with modern understanding of human psychological and spiritual potential. Perhaps most significantly, recovering early Christian diversity offers opportunities for Christian communities to move beyond the doctrinal rigidity and institutional authoritarianism that have characterized much of Christian history. Early Christian communities that emphasized personal spiritual experience while maintaining commitment to Jesus' central teachings about divine love and human transformation provide models for authentic Christian practice that transcends denominational boundaries and institutional limitations. The integration of recovered early Christian wisdom into contemporary spiritual practice doesn't require abandoning essential Christian insights about divine love, spiritual transformation, and ethical commitment. Rather, it offers opportunities for deepening and enriching those insights with additional spiritual resources that were available to early Christian communities but lost to later institutional development. Contemporary Christian communities are responding to these opportunities in various ways. Progressive denominations have begun incorporating insights from early Christian mystical traditions into worship, spiritual direction, and contemplative practice. Contemplative Christian movements are rediscovering meditation techniques and consciousness practices that parallel those described in suppressed early Christian texts. Interfaith dialogue has also been enriched by recognition that early Christianity shared more common ground with other mystical traditions than later institutional Christianity acknowledged. The emphasis on direct spiritual experience, consciousness development, and divine union found in early Christian texts provides bridges for meaningful dialogue with Buddhist, Hindu, and other contemplative traditions. However, the integration of recovered early Christian wisdom also presents ongoing challenges for institutional religious authority. If early Christian communities were more egalitarian, more mystically oriented, and less dependent on institutional mediation than later Christianity became, then recovering authentic early Christian practice might require significant changes in contemporary church structure and authority systems. Some Christian leaders have responded to these challenges by questioning the reliability or relevance of archaeological discoveries and scholarly research. This approach attempts to maintain traditional narratives by dismissing evidence that complicates them. However, this strategy becomes increasingly difficult as the accumulation of evidence makes traditional narratives harder to defend academically. Other Christian leaders have embraced historical discoveries as opportunities for spiritual renewal and institutional reform. This approach recognizes that authentic Christian faith should be strong enough to withstand historical scrutiny and flexible enough to incorporate new understanding about early Christian diversity and spiritual wisdom. The long-term implications of recovering early Christian spiritual wisdom extend beyond internal Christian development to broader cultural and spiritual evolution. If Christianity can successfully integrate its suppressed mystical traditions with contemporary spiritual seeking, it might provide resources for addressing spiritual needs that purely secular approaches haven't met effectively. The emphasis on consciousness development, divine connection, and spiritual transformation found in early Christian texts addresses human longings for meaning, purpose, and transcendent experience that remain relevant regardless of specific religious affiliation. Recovering this spiritual wisdom benefits not just Christian believers, but anyone interested in authentic spiritual development. Perhaps most importantly, the recovery of early Christian diversity demonstrates that authentic spiritual tradition is robust enough to encompass multiple perspectives and sophisticated enough to address complex spiritual needs. Rather than requiring doctrinal uniformity or institutional control, genuine spiritual tradition can embrace diversity while maintaining commitment to essential insights about divine love and human transformation. The implications for contemporary Christianity are profound. Opportunities for spiritual deepening, institutional renewal, expanded inclusivity, and enhanced relevance to contemporary spiritual seeking. Whether Christian communities seize these opportunities or resist them will largely determine Christianity's future capacity to address the spiritual needs of evolving human consciousness. The choice facing contemporary Christians isn't whether to accept historical evidence about early Christian diversity. That evidence is now too overwhelming to ignore. The choice is whether to embrace the spiritual opportunities that evidence provides, or to retreat into increasingly defensive positions that limit rather than expand Christian spiritual potential. The recovery of suppressed early Christian wisdom offers contemporary believers access to spiritual resources that their predecessors have been denied for centuries. How they use those resources will determine whether Christianity continues to evolve as a living spiritual tradition or becomes merely a historical artifact of humanity's spiritual past. As we reach the end of this extraordinary journey through hidden chambers, suppressed manuscripts, and recovered spiritual wisdom, we find ourselves standing at a threshold that extends far beyond academic curiosity or historical investigation. We've discovered that the spiritual heritage of humanity is far richer, far more complex, and far more empowering than institutional narratives have suggested. The evidence we've examined, from archaeological discoveries to sophisticated scholarly analysis, reveals that early Christian communities possessed spiritual wisdom and practices that could revolutionize contemporary understanding of faith, consciousness, and human potential. The systematic suppression of this wisdom represents not just historical tragedy, but ongoing spiritual impoverishment that affects anyone seeking authentic connection with divine reality. Yet this isn't a story of permanent loss or irreversible damage. The same forces that are revealing suppressed historical truth are also making it possible to recover and integrate spiritual wisdom that seemed lost forever. We're living in a unique moment when technological innovation, scholarly courage, and spiritual hunger are converging to restore access to humanity's complete spiritual heritage. The implications extend far beyond any single religious tradition. The emphasis on direct spiritual experience, consciousness development, and divine connection found in suppressed early Christian texts addresses universal human longings that transcend denominational boundaries. Whether you approach these discoveries from a place of traditional faith, spiritual seeking, or scholarly curiosity, they offer resources for spiritual development that weren't available to previous generations, but knowledge without application remains merely intellectual exercise. The spiritual wisdom we've explored today only becomes meaningful when it's integrated into daily spiritual practice, personal transformation, and authentic service to others. The early Christian communities that preserved this wisdom did so not as historical curiosity, but as living spiritual tradition that guided their daily lives and relationships. The question each of us must answer is how we'll respond to having access to spiritual resources that were hidden for centuries. Will we use this knowledge to deepen our own spiritual development? Will we share it with others who are seeking authentic spiritual guidance? Will we work to ensure that future generations have access to the complete spiritual heritage that previous generations were denied? The secret chambers of the Vatican may have been opened, but the more important opening is the one occurring in human consciousness as we recover suppressed spiritual wisdom and integrate it with contemporary understanding. This opening represents not the end of our spiritual journey, but the beginning of possibilities for spiritual development that seemed impossible just decades ago. If this exploration has resonated with your own spiritual seeking, if it's opened new questions or possibilities for your spiritual development, then consider subscribing to continue this journey together. There's so much more to discover, so much more wisdom to recover, and so much more potential for spiritual transformation to explore. And when you're ready to continue this investigation into suppressed spiritual wisdom, click on the next video that appears on your screen, because what we've discovered today is just the beginning of what becomes possible when we have the courage to seek truth wherever it leads us. Thank you for watching this video until the end. See you in the next video.